I'm sure there are many different ways of teaching Shakespeare, but the two different ways that I've run into are very different. Both of them are critical to fully understanding his work. Now, when I was a freshman in high school at North here in Salem, one of my English teachers was tasked with getting my portion of the freshman class to be able to pass a standardized test on the works of William Shakespeare. But that wasn't enough for him. He really wanted to make sure that we knew, understood, and really appreciated the incredible talent and brilliance of Shakespeare. But he also wanted us to feel it, to experience the passion and the raw emotion of the characters and what it would have been like to experience these plays for the very first time when they were acted live on stage. So we learned all about iambic pentameter and the Globe Theater and how different roles would have been played and some of the known costume choices and the particular and peculiar choices that Shakespeare made in some of the most famous phrases in his poems and plays. We learned about the sentence structure that he chose and the words that had double and sometimes triple meanings. And all of that was really helpful in seeing the behind the scenes and being able to be impressed with the genius of the man and his work. But it was, by definition, very academic, which was fine because we were, able to actually pass that test. But he wanted us to be plunged into what it was like to experience Shakespeare. And so we assigned each of us a role in the play Romeo and Juliet. We were all part of, the two different families, right? The Montagues and the Capulets. And we were all to live in fair Verona and take on the personalities and the mannerisms of our assigned characters, which we all knew quite well because we had just studied them academically. At that point, we didn't really know anything about the story just yet. Just that these two families hated each other and that this was one of the most romantic tales of all time. Well, when the time came for me to draw my character from the hat, I ended up pulling Romeo. It was just as embarrassing as you would expect for a freshman guy. But what was even more embarrassing for me was that one of the most beautiful girls in our class pulled Juliet. Needless to say, I was equally parts ecstatic and terrified. Now, it will come as no surprise to those of you who've read this masterpiece that over the next few days of reading this play out loud in class, with as much passion and honesty as we could all muster as 14-year-olds, it wasn't long until Juliet and I were dating in real life, because it was impossible not to get swept up in the romance and the raw emotion, right? This was just a classic play, and we were young kids, and man, it swept us away. But as you can guess, we came to the conclusion of this story. And we experienced the death of the love of Romeo and Juliet, and our love died as well. It was a very brief 2 weeks, but I still remember those feelings. I still remember experiencing Romeo and Juliet, not just because I knew the background of William Shakespeare and the details of how iambic pentameter flows and all of that nonsense, but mainly because my 14-year-old self experienced what Romeo experienced. I felt it deeply. But would I have experienced it if I didn't understand the background? If my English teacher hadn't walked us through the meaning of some of the confusing phrases and words that we had never heard before? Probably not. I think that both of those things were critical, not just for the ability to pass the test, but to gain the deep appreciation of this man's work and the way that he changed the world through his brilliant poetry and plays. And poetry is kind of like that, isn't it? Whether you're listening to your favorite song that always seems to bring back old memories, or you're reading Beowulf to your boys at night and they are ready to swim across the whale road and fight ancient monsters. Or if you're reading the prose of King David, recalling painful and terrifying moments when he called out to God for rescue and rest, There's a place for the background knowledge that it takes to understand and to experience the power that comes from just the right words as they speak to you deeply in your soul. Which brings us to the book of Psalms. 150 songs and poems and prayers that have been inspiring and comforting the world for at least 3,500 years. And around 500 BC, they were all gathered together into these 5 distinct books that have each had this flow and purpose and the retelling of the story of the people of God by many different authors over many, many different centuries. Just as an interesting side note, because I know some of you really enjoy this stuff, some of our Christian Orthodox brothers and sisters have a different numbering of the Psalms because they translate the Psalms from the Greek Septuagint, while most of us, our Protestantism and our Catholic Bibles, they're translated from the Hebrew. So anyway, just thought you'd find that interesting. They're all pretty much the same, just different numbers. Now, I told you last Sunday that I have personally struggled with this book. It's hard to read if you don't know what's going on and why it's organized the way that it is. And if you just open it up randomly and you just pick some psalm, there's a pretty solid chance that while it may be beautiful, it may not be helpful or even understandable. But as you get to know the basic layout of these 5 distinct books, it's easier to grasp what these collectors' intentions were as they organized these works together throughout these different centuries that they had collected them from. But it's not just the confusion of what's going on that makes it a difficult book. For me, there are real difficult psalms that are just dripping with rage and anger and depression. They're called imprecatory psalms, and they reveal the emotionally raw state of their authors as they cry out to God for some sort of answer or response to the pain and the suffering that they are feeling, mostly from their enemies. They invoke curses and judgment and catastrophe on the people or the nations that the author sees as their enemies. And most of them have been categorized in the very first 3 books of these 5, right? On this journey that the collectors were wanting us to go on as we read through this collection of 150 Psalms. Last week we talked a bit about the first book 1 of Psalms that makes up this collection. And it revolves around this desire for covenant faithfulness to God and the blessing that the Torah is for the people. These are the Psalms that David wrote while he was being taught by God how to be a king. If you remember the story of King David, then you're going to recall that when he was a young shepherd boy, he was chosen by God's prophet Samuel to be the king of Israel. The problem was that Israel had just chosen their first king, and it wasn't David's dad. But God was not pleased with Israel's first king, Saul. And so he sent Samuel to find this one who God had chosen to be this next king. The issue was that as David grew up, life was not what he had been promised by God. And these were poems, they were laments, and they were imprecatory psalms that make up the body of this first book. As written by David while he was on the run, being hunted by King Saul. He was living as an outlaw, and the people that he loved were dying, and nothing seemed to be going well. At every single turn, things seemed to be getting worse and worse. But even though everything was hard and he was constantly crying out to God for help, it was God who he was relying upon, and not his own knowledge or his own strength. David was learning what it was like, what it felt like to lead a life of faith. And we get to experience that journey along with him as we read through the first book of Psalms. These personal prayers and thoughts of David as he was in the thick of incredible stress and fear and on this emotional roller coaster. He knew his enemies. He was best friends with the son of the man who was trying to hunt him down and kill him. They'd eaten together, they had laughed together, sang together, and they had worshiped God together. And now he was living in caves and running for his life because the people who he had once considered as close as family now wanted to murder him. So when you read a psalm like Psalm 35. Knowing just that little bit about what was going on, you can start to feel what David was feeling, and you can get an idea of what God was continuing to teach him as he was being prepared to eventually become the king. So, knowing that little bit of background, here are just a couple of verses from Psalm 35. O Lord, oppose those who oppose me. Fight those who fight against me. Put on your armor and take up your shield. Prepare for battle and come to my aid. Bring shame and disgrace on those trying to kill me. Turn them back and humiliate them, those who want to harm me. So let sudden ruin come upon them. Let them be caught in the trap that they had set for me. Let them be destroyed in the pit that they dug for me. They repay me evil for good. I am sick with despair. Yet when they were ill, I grieved for them. I denied myself by fasting for them, but my prayers returned unanswered. I was sad as though they were my friends or family, as if I was grieving for my own mother. But they're glad now that I'm in trouble. They gleefully join together against me. How long, O Lord, will you look on and do nothing? Rescue me from their fierce attacks. Protect my life from these lions. Then I will thank you in front of the great assembly. I will praise you before all of the people. Oh Lord, you know all about this. Do not stay silent. Do not abandon me now, O Lord. Wake up. Rise to my defense. Take up my case, my God and my Lord. Declare me not guilty, O Lord my God, for you give justice. Don't let my enemies laugh about me in my troubles, but give great joy to those who came to my defense. Let them continually say, great is the Lord, who delights in blessing his servant with peace. Then I will proclaim your justice and will praise you all day long. Can you feel it? This deep sense of betrayal, the frustration, the fear and anxiety that's all being tempered with the resilient grit of faith that's being forged in real time. When you know just a little bit about what David was going through, you can start to understand and feel what he was feeling. You can start to relate to the betrayal that he was living through as his words are cried out to God. They can become your words as well. Like this shared experience that transverses the millennia. The second book of Psalms is the collection of Psalms that spans David's reign as king of Israel, along with some Psalms from some other authors, including David's son, King Solomon. It has the ups and the downs of imperfect people who are trying to rule a nation made up of imperfect people who are called to serve this perfect God. In this book, you'll find triumphs and complete failures, praise and laments and imprecatory psalms. They're all here. This is the king's songbook. It's kind of like getting to glance at the personal journal of the king through the lens of the collectors who've organized it in such a way that they're trying to bring all of these people of Israel together with this shared vision for the future and a culture that was centered around the future hope of the temple of God and the reign of this future messianic king. Because when the Psalms were finally organized, many centuries after most of these Psalms were written, the nation of Israel had been through some serious trauma. They had all seen the destruction of the temple, the fall of Israel to Assyria, and the Hebrew exile and eventual return from Babylon. It was all foreseen by the prophets who were calling out to Israel to account for their sins and to change their behavior in order to avoid such incredibly painful consequences. And due to such pain and trauma, the men who gathered these 150 Psalms knew that the Hebrew people needed to have something that brought them all together again, by experiencing something that they could all relate back to as this centralized cultural touchstone. That's what these Psalms were. It's the same thing that we've all experienced as well. in a multitude of different ways. Think of a good movie that you've seen. Have you ever experienced this? If you've met somebody new and you don't really have anything in common with them, but you've seen the same movie, right? And then you have this little connection point. You've experienced the same thing as they have, and now you have a place to start. Jacob Hewler was telling me last week just how amazed he's been at how many people have watched The West Wing. And now that he's watching through this amazing series, he's realizing that he has this powerful connection point with all of these different people that he would love to get to know better. Crystal and my dad and Christina and Vin and me and anybody else who's watched this series, The West Wing. Think of September 11th. Or maybe it's Columbine or Mount St. Helens eruption or the assassination of JFK or Bobby Kennedy. Moments that can instantly pull together Americans who've lived through them. Those who've served in the military experience this as well as they meet fellow service members who've experienced similar things that they have. The second book of Psalms works as an anchor point for the people of God. An experience that we can all share together that pulls us close. It speaks to the emotion and the passion of our humanity. And it calls us to look forward to the future reign of God over all of the earth. The Psalms that we have in our Bibles are not just these ancient poems that are thousands of years old. They are near perfect examples of how the raw human emotions that we all experience can and should be used to draw us together and to point us to God as our anchor point. Whether it's the joy of praising God, the rage of war, or the crushing weight of losing the people that we love. The Psalms are not meant to just be studied, they're meant to be experienced. As my freshman English teacher knew, you need some basic academic knowledge of the subject, but you can never know it fully through study alone. You have to dive in. You have to read through it and feel what the authors and the collectors were trying to design this book for you to experience. You're never going to understand the Psalms from a sermon alone, just as you're never going to know Shakespeare just by reading the Wikipedia page on him. You have to immerse yourself. So this week, as we continue to walk through Lent, this time of spiritual and emotional and mental preparation for the celebration of Easter, I highly, highly encourage you to dive into the Psalms and allow the Holy Spirit to use these age-old words to wash over you, to show you new yet ancient connection points with the people of God who've come before us and the God who's walked alongside us all since the very beginning of time.